They had called Rowena Blair a burden for 3 winters. On the longest night of the year, they meant to put her out in the snow. She learned it the way she learned everything in that house, from the wrong side of a door. She had been carrying a scuttle of coals up the back stair when she heard her name in the morning room, and she stopped on the cold landing with the iron handle biting her palm, and listened to the family decide her future as if she were a dog that had grown too old to keep. The quit notice was already written, Lady Eyleigh said. Rowena would leave at first light on the 1st of the year. There was no place in the house for a barren widow who had given them nothing, and the sooner the new year carried her off, the sooner the name might mend. Rowena did not drop the scuttle. She did not weep. She stood very still until the cold of the stone had come up through her thin soles and into her knees, and then she carried the coals the rest of the way up, because the nursery grate was empty, and the tenant child sleeping there was not warm, and warmth was a thing she could still give. If you have ever been the one nobody chose, stay with her. You will want to see what the snow brought. The Blair estate sat in a fold of the Highlands, where the wind came down off the bare hills with nothing to break it, and in the winter of 1816 it came down hungry. The harvest had failed the autumn before. The oats had rotted black in the field, the potatoes had come up soft, and the great house had answered the loss the way great houses did, by spending more on candles and claret than the whole parish would see in a year, and by pretending the crofts below the wall did not exist. Rowena had not pretended. That was, in the end, the unforgivable thing about her. She had come to the house at 21, a soldier's bride of 4 months, and within the year she had become a soldier's widow. Her husband, James Blair, had died at Waterloo on a field she would never see, and he had died before she could give the family the one thing they had wanted from the match, an heir, a small Blair to carry the line forward. The line had broken on his death, and because she was the nearest thing to blame that the family could reach, they had laid the breaking on her. She was barren. She was a fortune hunter who had brought no fortune. She was the cold interloper who had taken their son to the war and brought back nothing but herself. She was 24 now, and she looked older. The work had done that. Her hands were chapped and split at the knuckle from the well water and the lye, and her one good gown had worn to the colour of wet ash, and there were people in the parish who had met her a dozen times and still believed she was the housekeeper, because no lady they knew would carry a yoke of milk pails across a frozen yard at dawn. She did carry them. She had been carrying them all winter. When the harvest failed and the factor's books showed the crofts could not pay, Lady Eyleigh had ordered the rents collected all the same, and Rowena had quietly gone where the matriarch did not go. She had walked the crofts in the dark with what she could carry, a half-sack of meal lifted from the back of the larder, a jar of honey, a folded blanket, a packet of the bitter willow bark that brought a fever down. She had sat up 2 nights with the Ross baby when its chest filled, and she had shown Mary Ross how to steam the croup out of it over a basin, and the baby had lived. She had read the factor's rent book by candle, and found 3 families he meant to turn out, and she had paid their arrears herself out of the last of her widow's money, £12 that had been all she had in the world, and she had told no one. Old Tam knew. The factor was a hard man, but not a blind one, and he had watched the rent book balance itself by a hand that was not his, and he had said nothing because saying it would have done her no good in that house. But he watched her now with something in his face that was almost grief. Inside the walls, none of it counted. Inside the walls there was Isabel. Isabel Blair was James's younger sister, 22 and the acknowledged beauty of 3 parishes, and she moved through the cold house like a flame somebody had lit to spite the dark. She had black hair and a white throat and a laugh she used the way a duellist used a blade, and she had decided long ago that Rowena's continued existence was a personal insult. It was Isabel who had named her the Mouse. It was Isabel who, when a guest mistook Rowena for staff, would let the mistake stand, and then apologise for it sweetly, so that the cruelty wore the face of grace. It was Isabel who had a new gown of silver tissue hanging in her press for the Hogmanay ball, and who spoke of the Duke of Glenmara as though the man were already a thing she owned and had only to send for. "He will choose me, of course," Rowena heard her say, the week before the ball, to the glass in the long gallery, turning her white shoulders in the cold light. "A duke must marry, and there is no one else in the county worth the looking at." She had caught Rowena's reflection behind her own then, and smiled at it. "Are you still here? I keep forgetting. You have such a gift for not being seen." Rowena had inclined her head and gone on with the polishing. Her power, what little she had kept, lived in the things she did not say. "We are paupers playing at Lord's, Isabel," she might have said. "The granary is empty and the crofters are starving and you are buying silver tissue." But there was no profit in it, and she had stopped spending herself on people who could not hear. That night she went up to the cold little room under the eaves that they let her keep, and she took out her one trunk, and she began, quietly, to pack. She folded the ash-grey gown and the 2 shifts and the comb that had been her mother's, and she laid James's miniature on the top, where she could see his painted face, and she did not cry over it, because she had cried over it for 3 years, and the well had a bottom after all. She had decided. She would not wait to be put out like a dog at the turn of the year. She would walk out of her own accord at first light on Hogmanay, with her back straight and her trunk in her hand, and she would keep the one thing they had never managed to take from her, which was the right to leave a room before she was thrown from it. Beathag, the kitchen maid and the only friend she had under that roof, found her packing and sat down on the end of the cot, and cried for both of them. "Where will you go?" she said. "It is the dead of winter. You will die on the road." "I will go to the Dowager at Strathmar and ask for a place," Rowena said. "I can keep a house. I can keep books. Someone will have me for my hands, if not for my name." She smoothed the lid of the trunk. "And if no one will, then I will have died on my own feet, Beathag, and that is more than I will do here." Below them, through the floor, came the thin sound of Isabel at the pianoforte, playing something bright and cold, and the laughter of the family warming themselves at a fire the crofters had no coal to light. Duncan MacRae, Duke of Glenmara, had been to a great many balls since the title fell on him, and he had hated everyone. He had not been raised to it. He was the second son, and second sons in the Glenmara line were raised to be useful and forgotten, to take a commission, to manage a corner of the estate, to stand a respectful half-step behind the brother who mattered. For 30 years that had been his whole geography. He had gone for a soldier, because it was the one thing a spare son was good for, and he had been good at it, and he had come home from the war with a French ball still lodged near the bone of his hip, so that he walked now with a stick and a hitch in his stride that the cold made worse. He had a long scar that ran from his temple into his hair, white now, where a sabre had opened him at Quatre Bras. And then, within 18 months, a fever had taken his father and his elder brother both, and the thing he had never been shaped for had landed on him entire. He was the Duke of Glenmara. He was, the gossip said, one of the richest men north of the border, and the same society that had looked straight through him for 30 years, that had let its eyes slide off the limping, scarred second son at the edge of every room, had turned all at once and begun to smile. That was the part he could not stomach. He remembered it too well, being unseen. He remembered standing at the wall at his brother's betrothal ball, while a girl he had liked looked through him to the air across the room. He remembered a whole life of being the one not chosen, the one whose name no one troubled to learn, and he remembered exactly how it had felt, like being a pane of glass that people looked through to the weather beyond. He had made a kind of peace with it. He had built a hard, plain, useful self out of it, and now they smiled at him. Now the mothers steered their daughters into his path, and the beauties found his scar romantic and his limp distinguished, and every white throat in every ballroom turned toward his coronet like a flower toward the only son in the room. He knew precisely what they saw when they smiled. It was not him. He had been him for 30 years, and not one of them had bothered. They saw 30,000 a year, and a castle and a coronet, and they had taught themselves to find the rest of him charming in the time it took to read a peerage. He trusted none of them. He had learned to read a smile the way he had once learned to read ground before a charge, to see where the soft places were, the places that would not hold. His aunt, the Dowager Lady Strathmar, who was the bluntest woman in the Highlands, and the only person alive who said true things to his face, had told him he was becoming a hermit and a bore. You sit in that cold barracks of a castle, and you let it make you bitter, she had said, and bitterness is the dullest of all the sins. Come to the Hogmanay ball at the Camerons. The whole county will be there. Half of them will throw their daughters at your head, and you may stand in a corner and despise them, which I know you enjoy. But come. Why, he had said, would I do that? Because you are looking for one honest face, the old woman had said, and you will not find it sitting alone. You will only find it in a crowd, the way you find the one sound thing in a barrel of bad apples, by going through the lot. He had gone. He told himself it was to please his aunt, and to silence her, and because a duke who never appeared bred worse talk than one who appeared and scowled. He did not tell himself the other thing, which was that some stubborn, unhealed part of him still wanted, against all the evidence of his life, to be looked at by someone whose eyes did not first go to the coronet. He arrived at the Cameron house on the last night of the year, as himself. No incognito, no borrowed name, the scar and the stick and the dukedom all on plain show, and he stood at the edge of the great bright ballroom, with the snow beginning to tick against the black windows, and he watched the county arrange itself for his benefit, and he prepared to be bored to the bone. He noticed the grey gown because it was the only one in the room not trying to be noticed. The ballroom was a riot of colour, silver tissue and primrose and rose, jewels under the chandeliers, 200 candles and a fire you could have roasted an ox at, and every bright thing in it was angled, however carefully, toward the door he had come through, except one. Near the servants' passage, half in the shadow of a pillar, a woman in a plain gown the colour of wet ash stood holding a tray she had clearly taken from a footman's hands, and she was not looking at the Duke at all. She was looking at an old man by the fire, the Cameron grandfather, palsied and forgotten in his chair while his family danced, and she crossed the floor and crouched down in front of him, and held a cup of negus to his shaking hands, steadying them so that he could drink without shame. Nobody else in the room had seen the old man at all. Duncan had been watching for exactly that, for the place where the floor was soft, for the one true thing in the barrel, and he found it there, in a grey gown, on her knees on the stone. He asked his aunt, low, who she was. That, said Lady Strathmar, and there was something in the old woman's voice he could not place, is Rowena Blair, the Blair widow. They keep her like a scullery maid, and blame her for their dead son, and they mean to put her out of doors. You will hear all about how cold and barren and grasping she is before the night is over. You will hear it from that one. She nodded at a dark-haired girl in the silver tissue, who was even now arranging herself in the Duke's eye-line with the patience of a hunter. Watch them both. You have a good eye. Use it. He used it. He watched the girl in silver tissue, Isabel, he gathered, the beauty, the one the family was steering toward him, and he watched her be charming, and he was not charmed. He had seen the performance too many times to be moved by a good one. She laughed at the right moments, and touched her own throat and let her eyes go soft when they crossed his, and every motion of her was a door held open onto the coronet, and behind the door he could not find a single room with anyone living in it, and he watched the widow in grey, who did not look at him once. He watched her settle the old man, and then slip back toward the passage, and on the way a footman stumbled with a laden tray and a glass went over, and a long red stain of claret spread across the front of the grey gown. Her only gown, he would later understand, and she would walk out of this house in it tomorrow, and the footman went white with terror, because a spilt glass on a guest could cost a servant his place, and Rowena Blair looked down at the ruin of the one good thing she owned, and then she looked at the boy's frightened face, and she said something to him, quiet, that put the colour back in his cheeks, and she took the cloth from his hand and helped him gather the glass off the floor so that no one should slip on it, for no gain, with no one of any importance watching, with the whole bright room turned the other way. Duncan stood very still by the wall, leaning on his stick, and felt something move in his chest that he had thought the war and the betrayals and the 30 years of glass had killed for good. She is the only person in this room, he thought, who has not once looked to see who is watching. Every other soul here is a mirror. She is a window. He did not cross the floor. It was not yet the moment, and he had learned patience in harder schools than this one. But he stood at the wall with the snow ticking at the glass, and he watched the woman they were going to throw into it, and somewhere under the scar and the title and the long cold habit of being unchosen, the second son, who knew exactly what it was to be looked through, made up his mind to do the one thing no one had ever done for him. Lady Eilidh Blair had planned the evening like a campaign, and she sprang it at the turn of the dancing, when the floor was full and the county was watching. She had Isabel by the hand, resplendent in silver, and she brought her forward toward the Duke through a parting crowd, and she pitched her voice to carry, because she meant it to carry. She said that the Blairs were honoured beyond words by his Grace's presence, that her daughter Isabel had long admired the noble example his Grace set the county, and that the family being now reduced by grief, they had been forced to certain hard economies, among them the release of a dependent who had too long been a burden on their charity, the late James's widow, who would be leaving them at the new year, that very dawn, to make her own way at last. It was beautifully done. It buried the cruelty inside the courtesy. It put Isabel in the Duke's eyeline as the shining future, and Rowena out the door as the discarded past, and it dared the whole room with its smiling certainty to see it any other way. And the room, which loved a winner and feared Lady Eyelith, began obediently to see it her way. Rowena was standing near the passage when she heard herself dismissed to 200 people. She felt the heat come up her neck, and she kept her face still by an act of will she had practiced for 3 years. She had known it was coming. She had even meant to spare them the trouble and go before the dawn. But to hear it spoken aloud as a kindness, with the county nodding along, that was a new depth, and she set her jaw against it, and looked at the floor, and waited for it to be over so that she could go and be sick in private. The Duke of Glenmara handed his glass to a passing footman, and he took up his stick, and he walked. The room understood at once that something was wrong because he did not walk toward the silver tissue. Isabel had already begun her curtsy, already begun the soft-eyed lift of her chin, and he went past her as though she were a chair. He went past the celebrated beauties of 3 parishes. He crossed the whole bright length of that ballroom with his halting, scarred, deliberate stride, and the music faltered and died, and 200 faces turned to follow him, and he walked until he was standing in front of the widow in the claret-stained grey gown, the burden they were throwing out into the snow. He bowed to her, as deep as his bad hip would allow. "Madam," he said, into a silence you could have heard a candle gutter in, "I have been watching you this hour. I do not think there is a better spent hour in my life." He straightened. "Will you dance with me?" Rowena looked at him. She did not simper or pale or flutter. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, straight and unhurried, and what was in her face was not triumph but a kind of wary disbelief, as if she suspected a trap and was deciding whether she had the strength to survive another one. "Your Grace will forgive me," she said, low and clear. "I am the help. You have made a mistake." "No," said the Duke. "For the first time tonight, I have not." And he held out his gloved hand, palm up, and left it there in the silence, open, and waited. She put her work-roughened hand into the Duke of Glenmara's, and he closed his fingers over it, and he led her out onto the floor in front of the family who had just thrown her away. Behind them, the whispers broke like a wave on stone. Behind them, Isabel Blair's lovely face went white, and then a mottled, ugly red, in front of everyone who had ever envied her. Behind them, Lady Eyelith stood with her campaign in ruins and her mouth open on a courtesy that had nowhere left to go. And Rowena Blair, who had not been chosen for anything in 24 years, danced. The blizzard broke an hour later, and it was the storm in the end that married them, though neither of them would have said so then. They had been dancing and talking in the low, spare way of 2 people who have both learned not to spend words they cannot afford, when the great doors blew open on a gust of white, and a man came stumbling in out of the dark, Hugh the shepherd, snow to his thighs, his face raw with cold and terror. He had come up from the crofts because the river ford had risen and frozen wrong, and there were children caught on the wrong side of it, the Ross children among them, 4 of them, who had gone down to the low pasture at dusk to bring in a strayed ewe and not come back, and the snow was coming down now, so thick a man could not see his own hand, and they would be dead by morning if they were not found. The ballroom received this the way ballrooms receive the world's trouble. There was a flurry of dismay and a great deal of talk, and several ladies declared it too dreadful and called for their wraps in case the cold should reach the windows. Lady Eyelith said it was a great pity, but the tenants' children were the tenants' affair, and the storm was far too wild to send the gentlemen out into. Isabel said nothing at all. She had drawn back near the fire and was watching the Duke to see what he would do, the better to do something near it. Rowena was already moving. She had let go of the Duke's hand without a word, and she crossed to Hugh and took him by the arm and asked him 3 short questions. Where? How long? How many? And then she was stripping off her dancing things and calling for Beethag, and for lanterns and for rope, and her voice in that helpless room was the only voice that knew what it wanted. She did not ask Lady Eyelith's leave. She did not ask anyone's leave. She knew the low pasture. She had walked it 100 times with meal on her back. She knew the line of the wall a body could follow in the dark when the world had gone white. "I will need every man who can stand the cold and every lantern in the house," she said, "and I will need them now, not after the brandy." "You will catch your death," said a woman near her, scandalized. "In this? It is madness. Let the men decide it." "The men are deciding it," Rowena said, pulling a footman's heavy coat over the ruined gown. "By the fire, where it is warm. I am going to go and get the children." And she went, out through the blown-open door into the screaming white, with a lantern in her split-knuckled hand, and Beathag behind her, and Hugh, and after a moment, shamed by a widow in a borrowed coat, 3 of the Cameron grooms. The Duke of Glenmara watched the door swallow her, and then he picked up a lantern of his own. His aunt caught his sleeve. "Your hip," Lady Strathmore said. "Duncan, you can barely walk a ballroom." "Then I will be slow," he said. "Give me the lantern." And he limped out into the storm after the only person he had ever met who had not waited to be told her worth before she spent it. It was 3 hours in the dark, and the wind. Afterward, Rowena could never put it in order. The cold that stopped being painful and began to be a kind of warmth, which she knew to be the dangerous kind. The children found at last in the lee of a fallen dike, the 4 of them and the lost ewe huddled together, the eldest girl with the baby inside her own coat, all of them too cold to cry. She had got the smallest 2 up against her own body inside the great coat, and she had turned the whole shivering string of them back along the wall toward the lights, counting them at every dike, and somewhere in the worst of it the Duke had been there in the dark beside her, scarred and limping and saying nothing, taking the heaviest child onto his own back so that she could carry the 2 small ones, the pair of them breaking trail through snow to the waist, while the storm tried to take the breath out of their mouths. They brought every child home. Not one was lost. When they came back through the blown doors into the firelight, white to the eyebrows, the children blue and breathing, Mary Ross came across that grand ballroom on her knees, and took Rowena's frozen hands and pressed them to her own wet face, and could not speak, and did not need to. Later, the children warmed and wrapped and sleeping by the kitchen fire, the storm still howling at the glass. The Duke found Rowena alone in a cold side passage, leaning against the wall with her eyes shut, finally letting herself shake. "Why did you go?" he said. "They had already thrown you out. You owed this house nothing. You could have stood at the fire with the rest and let the children freeze, and no one would have blamed the discarded widow. Why did you go out into that?" She opened her eyes. She was too tired to guard them, and so for once he saw all the way in. "I did not stay to be pitied, Your Grace," she said. "I stayed because the children would not be fed if I left, and tonight they would not have been found." She looked at her own ruined hands. "It is the only thing I've ever been good for. I would rather die doing it than live being thanked for nothing." The Duke of Glenmara looked at her for a long moment in the cold passage, and something in his hard, scarred face came undone. "You are not alone in it any more," he said. "That is the only thing I came out into the snow to tell you. Whatever you carry, you are not the only one carrying it now." It was not a declaration of love. Neither of them would have known what to do with one. But she heard what it was, which was a man who had been a window all his life telling another window that he had seen her, and she put her shaking hand briefly over his, glove to glove, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Isabel Blair did not surrender a duke to a scullery widow without a war. She let the night of the storm pass, and the day after, and then she went to work, because she had decided, coldly in front of her glass, where she decided everything, that what had happened in the ballroom was an aberration, a moment of a strange man's strange whim, and that whims could be unmade by anyone patient enough to whisper. So, she whispered. She had a gift for it. She did not invent a single new thing. That was the cruelty of it, and the skill. She took the true things and turned them a quarter turn into poison. The widow had walked the crofts alone at night. What sort of woman walked alone at night, and to whom? The widow had handled the factor's rent book, and was it not strange that the book should balance just as £12 went missing from somewhere? Had anyone counted the silver? The widow had failed to give James an heir in a year of marriage. Barren, they all knew it. And what was a duke who needed sons doing tying himself to a barren woman, unless she had got her claws into him some other way, the way a clever fortune hunter does, by playing the saint with the tenant's brats, where a soft-hearted man could see. She let it spread. She let it cool the invitations and warm the whispers. And then she chose her ground. There was to be a great gathering at the Cameron House on 12th night to close the season. The same grand rooms, the same county, the same chandeliers under which the Duke had crossed the floor. Isabel meant it to be the room where she crossed it back. She had got her mother's help, and she had got a thing she thought was a weapon. She had been to the factor and pressed him, and she had come away believing there was a hole in the rent book and 12 missing pounds she could lay at Rowena's door in front of everyone, and brand the saint a thief, and watch the Duke's strange whim die of shame. Old Tam, the factor, let her believe it. He was a hard man, and not a kind one, but he had watched Rowena Blair pay 3 families' arrears out of her own dead husband's money and tell no one, and he had something in his pocket he had been keeping a long time, and he was a patient man too. Word of the campaign reached Glenmara, where Rowena had been brought, not yet as a wife, the banns not yet read, but as a guest the Duke had installed in his cold, echoing castle with a fierce propriety, his aunt the dowager in residence as her chaperone, and her champion both. Rowena had begun, without being asked, to warm the place. A fire lit in the dead library, the household books opened and balanced, the half-starved village beyond the Glenmara wall quietly visited. She heard the whispers as they came north, and she went still, the old stillness, the bracing of a woman who has been here before. "They mean to call me a thief at the 12th night ball," she told the Duke plainly, over the library fire. "Isabel, in front of the county. She thinks she can make the books accuse me." She looked at him steadily. "Your Grace should know what you have tied yourself to before the rope draws tight. I will not blame you if you wish it untied. I am used to being let go." The Duke of Glenmara set down his glass. "Let me tell you what I have learned about a public room," he said, slow and cold. "I have stood at the wall of 100 of them, unseen, and I learned this, that the same crowd that will believe a lie because it is whispered will believe the truth far harder when it is shown. They want to watch you proven a thief? Then we will go, and we will let them watch, and what they will see instead is everything you have done, with their own eyes, and they will never unsee it." His scarred face was very hard and very calm. "I will not hide you, Rowena. Hiding you is what they have done your whole life. We are going to do the opposite. Let it happen in the open. I would back what you are against what she is in any room she chooses to pick. It was not comfort. It was something better than comfort. It was a man making her worth a public wager and not flinching from the stakes. The 12th night ball was everything Isabel had built it to be. The great rooms blazing, the whole county packed in under the chandeliers, the air thick with beeswax and hothouse lilies, and the particular electric hush of a room that has come to watch a fool. They had come to see the scullery widow brought low. The whispers had done their work. Rowena could feel it the moment she entered on the Duke's arm, the cool turning of 200 faces, the appraising silence that had judged her a fraud before she crossed the threshold. She wore a gown the Duke's aunt had given her, a deep plain blue, no jewels, and against the silver and rose of that room she looked exactly what she was, a plain weathered woman among bright ones, and she had stopped, long ago, expecting that to be enough to save her. Isabel sprang it before the dancing, as her mother had a fortnight before because the Blairs liked an audience for their cruelties. She came forward in white and silver, and she was very sweet and very grieved, and she said that it pained her beyond words to raise such a thing on such a night, but that the family's honour compelled her. She said there had been money missing from the estate this 12-month past, £12, gone from the rents in the autumn, and that the books had been in only one person's keeping. She turned with sorrow on her lovely face toward Rowena. She said she did not wish to believe it of her brother's widow, but his Grace, before he bound a great name to her, deserved to know whose hands he had taken. She had the factor's word, she said, that the rents had come up £12 short, and that Rowena Blair had kept the book. The room turned to judge her. Rowena felt it land, the old weight, the old heat up the neck, the 200 faces tilting toward the verdict they had already half written. The trap was beautifully made, because it was true at the edges. The money had moved, the book had been in her hands, and the thing she had actually done with it, paid 3 poor families' debts out of her own purse and told no one, was exactly the kind of truth that sounds, said aloud in a hostile room, like the lie a thief would tell. She did not weep. She did not rage. She lifted her head and met Isabel's eyes across the bright floor, and she said, low and clear, into the waiting hush, "The money is accounted for. I will tell you where it went, and you may believe me or not, as you choose. but I will not beg you to." And Isabel smiled, because to the room it sounded like exactly what a cornered woman says when the books have caught her, and she thought, in that moment, that she had won. The Duke of Glenmara stepped forward into the centre of the floor, and the room fell silent the way it had once before, because a duke who walks into the middle of a room means to be heard. "Before the widow says a word in her own defence," he said, "I will say several in mine, because you have come tonight to watch a trial, and I find I should like to conduct it properly." His cold eyes went round the room, unhurried, and they did not slide off a single face. "You accuse her of taking £12. Let us by all means speak of the £12. But first, let us speak of who in this county actually knows where the parish's money has gone this hungry winter, because I have made it my business, this fortnight past, to find out." He turned toward the door, and he raised his voice only a little. "Tam, if you please." Old Tam came forward through the parting crowd, the estate factor, hard and grey and steady, with a great rent book under his arm and something folded inside his coat, and the room rustled, because the factor was the one man whose word on the rents no one could wave away. "His Grace asked me for the truth of the book," Tam said, "and I have kept the truth of it 3 winters, waiting for a room that would hear it." He opened the great ledger on the table where all could see, and he laid his blunt finger on the autumn page. The £12 that left the rents did not leave the estate. It paid the arrears of 3 families the harvest had ruined, the Frasers, the McInneses, and the widow Gunn, who would have been turned out into that same snow these children were near lost in. It was paid the week before Martinmas, and it was not paid out of the estate's purse. He looked up, and his hard old eyes found Rowena and softened. It was paid out of hers, £12 of her own widow's money, the last she had in the world, given to keep 3 families under a roof, and set down nowhere because she charged me to set it down nowhere. There is your missing money, Miss Isabel. It is not missing. It is keeping your father's tenants alive. The hush in the room changed its weather entirely, but old Tam was not finished. He drew the folded thing from his coat, and his hand was not quite steady. "And since we are at last in a room that means to hear the truth," he said, "His Grace should have this, that has been kept from her 3 years by a hand in this very house." He held it out. It is the last letter Captain James Blair wrote before Waterloo. It came to the house with his effects. It was opened, and read, and put away, and never given to the woman it was written for. I know, because I was made to carry it to the strong box, and I have been ashamed of it ever since. He gave it to the Duke, and the Duke gave it to Rowena, and Rowena's hands shook as they had not shaken in the snow. "You need not read it aloud," the Duke said to her low. But Mary Ross's voice came up clear from the side of the room where the tenant folk had come to stand. They had walked up from the crofts and packed the lower doorway. Mary and Hugh and the Gunns and the Frasers and a dozen more, the people Rowena had fed. "Read it, my lady," Mary said. "Let them hear what manner of woman they have called a burden." So Rowena read it, in her low, clear voice, into the most silent room in 3 parishes. It was not long. James had written that if he did not come home, his family were to know that the best thing he had ever done was to marry Rowena, that she was the truest heart he had ever known, that she would keep faith with anyone who let her, and that he begged them, these were his words, in his hand, to keep her and cherish her as the one good thing he was leaving behind. They had read it, they had known, and they had locked it in a box, and called her barren and a burden and a thief for 3 years, with her dead husband's love for her folded up in the dark the whole time. When she finished, there were people weeping who had come to watch her fall. The Duke of Glenmara turned to the room, and his voice when it came was not loud, and it did not need to be. "You called her cold," he said. "I have just watched her carry 4 children home through a blizzard, while finer women wept for their gowns. You called her barren, as though a woman's whole worth could be weighed in an air, as though the 3 families she saved this winter were nothing, as though the tenants standing in that doorway who walked through snow tonight to defend her name are nothing. You called her a fortune hunter, and she gave away the last £12 she owned and told no one, and would have walked out of this county at dawn with 1 trunk and her pride, and asked you for nothing." His scarred face moved round the silent room. "I spent 30 years being looked through by rooms exactly like this one. I know precisely what you are because you did it to me when I was a second son and no use to you, and you would do it to her tomorrow. I am not going to let you." He turned to Rowena, and he took her hand, the rough split-knuckled hand, in front of all of them. "You are about to turn out the only soul in either house who knows how to keep it alive," he said. "I will be taking her with me, as my wife, if she will have a scarred man who has overlooked his whole life as well." A breath. "Rowena Blair, will you have me?" And Rowena, who had not been chosen for anything in 24 years, looked at the man who had crossed 2 rooms to see her, and the people in the doorway who had walked through snow for her, and she said simply, the way she said everything true, "I will." Across the floor, Isabel Blair stood alone in her white and silver, with the lie come apart in her hands, and the county that had come to watch a widow fall turned, as one, to look instead at the beauty who had brought them there, and the Blairs, mother and daughter, walked out of that ballroom into a silence worse than any storm. 1 year on, by the next Hogmanay, every croft window in the valley below Glenmara was lit. It had become the custom in a single winter, the candles in the low windows on the longest night, so that no child of that parish need ever again be lost in the dark for want of a light to walk toward. Rowena had asked for it, and what the Duchess of Glenmara asked for in that valley now, the valley gladly did, because she had earned it stone by stone the way she earned everything. She was the Duchess of Glenmara. She had stopped flinching at the word. The cold castle had a fire in every room a person used, and the dead library was a living one now, and the granary the failed harvest had emptied had been rebuilt and filled, so that when the next lean winter came, and it would come, there would be meal in the valley and no children on the wrong side of a frozen ford. The crofts thrived under her hand. The rent book balanced honestly, and old Tam's writing and her own, with nothing folded away in the dark. James's letter had been read aloud, that once, and then laid where it belonged. His grave, which the family had let the moss take, was tended now. She had seen to it herself, and the Duke had stood beside her in the churchyard the day it was set right, and held her hand, and said nothing, which was the thing he was best at, and the thing she had come to love most. The Blairs' fortunes had gone the way that cruelty's fortunes go. Lady Eyllith's great match for Isabel had collapsed within the season. The gentleman, it turned out, had been after a fortune the failed harvest had eaten, and when he learned the Blairs were as poor as their tenants, he was gone like snow off a wall. Isabel had married, in the end, a hard man with money and no tenderness in him at all, and the marriage had soured fast, and the silver tissue had gone the way of the season that bought it. And so, it was that on a grey afternoon in the new year, Isabel Blair came north to Glenmara, diminished, in a hired gig and a turned gown, to ask the woman she had tried to brand a thief for help. She did not say it well. Pride is a hard thing to unlearn in a year. But she said, at last, that she had nowhere else, and that she had heard the Duchess was building a school for the crofters' children, and that she could at least teach, having nothing else now of any use, if the Duchess could find it in her to let her. Rowena could have returned every cruelty with interest. The room they were in was warm and hers, and Isabel's was cold and gone, and the ledger of 3 winters would have balanced very sweetly with a single hard word. She did not say it. "There is a place at the school," Rowena said, in her low, clear voice, "and it is real work, not charity, and I will hold you to it, as I would hold anyone. The children are behind their letters, and they deserve better than they have had. You will teach them honestly, and you will be paid honestly, and you will not be told once in this valley that you are a burden." She held the door, the way she had once been left standing on the wrong side of so many. "Come in out of the cold, Isabel. You will catch your death." Isabel Blair came in out of the cold and wept, and was, for the first time in her life, in no position to do anything about being seen exactly as she was, and was met, all the same, with grace, which is the only thing that had ever been able to disarm her, because she had never once in her life expected it. That night, the longest night, the Duke of Glenmara found his wife at the library window, watching the croft candles come up one by one in the dark valley. There was a child asleep upstairs, the Duke's young orphaned ward, a cousin's son the war had left with no one, whom Rowena was raising now as her own, so that the woman they had branded barren had a small warm life curled up under her roof after all, depending on her hands the way the whole valley did. The Duke set his stick aside and held out his gloved hand, palm up, the way he had once held it out in a ballroom across a frozen silence, and left it there, open, and waited. She put her hand in his. They did not need the music. He turned her slowly through a dance by the hearth, the scarred man and the plain woman, the second son and the widow, while every window in the valley burned against the dark. Two people the world had looked straight through had, on the longest night of the year, finally been seen by each other. If this story warmed you on a cold night, stay a moment longer. Tell me in the comments about the person in your own life who saw you when no one else did. And if you believe the overlooked ones deserve their winter answered with grace, give this a like and subscribe so the next quiet story can find its way to you. The lights are still on in the valley. Come back and sit by them again.